Okay, here's the 800-pound gorilla, rent control. Again, this is less of an issue for single-family homes. It's more specific to multifamilies. If you have a single-family home in an area that has rent control implemented, you still have another exit strategy. You can fix up the house and then sell it on MLS to an owner-occupant who's going to live there, so you're not affected by the rent control. But for a multifamily like a fourplex, rent control can really affect you. So what happened here, this was in California. A California investor owned a fourplex and then rent control was enacted. This was Southern California. Now that puts limits on the amount of income the property could generate and how desirable the property is for resale. Because when you say rent control, you really can't sell a fourplex to an owner occupant. In most cases, you're going to sell it to another investor. And when they hear rent control, they run for the hills. So what are some things we can do, Brian?
I think if you take that first bullet point that you just laid up there, do not invest in tenant-friendly environments. And I'm speaking from having a portfolio in California for my first 15 years of being a professional landlord. And now Florida is apples and pumpkins compared to
night and day.
You know, yeah. I mean, I just can't stress enough that you need to be in a landlord business-friendly environment. Otherwise, you're really just, you're climbing a hill, and who wants to do that in your investment? A lot of our investors are busy professionals, like I said, and they want it to be as passive as possible. If you're investing in a landlord-friendly state, you're going to have a lot of work for you. I don't even if you have it managed by a third party, you're going to get dragged into all kinds of conversations. And I mean, this is horror stories. I mean, I can give you one if you'd like.
Sure.
So it was a RealWealth client. I'm not going to mention names for confidentiality. They came to me very frustrated, not because they were frustrated with us, because they just wrote a check as a court order from the judge in the city of San Francisco to their tenants that they had been in court with for 12, 16 months, just battling back and forth. They haven't paid the rent. The judge, because they were in a landlord-friendly environment, and the city of San Francisco is a very radical. I'm sorry.
Tenant-friendly.
No, tenant-friendly in the city of San Francisco. The judge ordered our client, in order to, because they were going to do a 1031 exchange with us, and they were moving the money out of California. Out of his proceeds, he had to write a check for $100,000 to his tenants that hadn't paid him in the last 12 months before he could sell the property. I mean, I've been doing it for 25 years. It's the most extreme example that I have ever heard of, but it's a reality for one of my clients. So I would say Joe has a great tip there. I think that will mitigate a ton of headaches for you. Stay away from tenant-friendly environments.
Yeah, even places that are landlord-friendly, if the political winds are shifting, you have to be sensitive to that as well. And what about the Section 8 program? Does that protect you from any rent control? Since it's a federal program, does that supersede local ordinances?
So again, real estate is localized. So the HUD program is a federally run program that is managed by local agencies, as you sort of say here. So it's really up to the local city and municipality. What happens in the markets that we're in is they pull comps. So they're just looking at 9 times out of 10, I can tell you from experience, because I have dealt with Section 8 a lot in our older renovated product, that rents are usually within $50 to $100, so 5 to 10% of what we would get if it was not Section 8, right? So it's not a radical change for us. So it just depends on the market that you're in, I guess, is the takeaway there.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of people think that because the federal program, that it's federal, that it might, it's not subject to the local ordinances, but that's not the case because it's implemented at the local level. If you think about it, I mean, how does the federal government know what an apartment should go for in, some zip code in Alabama? They have no idea, so they have to rely on the local people to determine that.
Totally
so
agree.
Here's an example I just got off the wire on Monday of this week. In Portland, Oregon, landlords must now pay relocation costs of tenants who can't afford rent increases. So if you raise the rent on your tenant and they say they can't afford it, then you have to pay their relocation costs so they can move somewhere else, which is crazy. So, or from our point of view. So when you talk about rent control or being in a landlord-friendly state, it's surprising how bad it can really be. Uh, I would have never guessed this. Somebody would have passed a law like this.
When you look at the scenario I just gave you.
Yeah, 100,000. All right, appraisals. So here's another scenario. This is a do-it-yourselfer. This was not a property provided by RealWealth Network. An investor purchased a triplex and put a lot of money into upgrades. And because of the upgrades, she was able to get higher rents, and so the net operating income improved. And then when she went to sell the property, she found out it was appraised no higher than other triplexes in that same neighborhood. And the reason is the multifamily, even though it's 2 to 4 units, it's still considered residential, not commercial, and it goes by residential rules. So the appraiser is going to evaluate based on comps what similar properties the neighborhood have sold for. Has that been your experience as well?
100%. And that's where the saying "you make your money when you buy" comes from, especially in existing product like you're using in this example. In new construction, it's less of an issue, and we find that the comps or the appraisals always come in higher than what we're selling to the investor. But I mean, the way that is mitigated is just to make sure that you're buying the property at the right price, right? Because that saying is so true. You make your money when you buy.
Yeah. So the way our property teams do it in existing markets, they work backwards. So they say, given this neighborhood and given the kind of property it is, what will the after repair value be? And once they identify that number, then they back into what can my renovation budget be? How much can I afford to put into this in order to make it make sense for an investor? And if that's too high, then they can't buy the property because the numbers aren't going to work. So if you start with the end, the ARV, the after repair value, and then reverse engineer how much you're going to pay for the property, like you said, make the money when you buy it, and how much you can afford to spend on the renovation, then you won't get a bad surprise as this investor did. All right, last one, legal liability. So this was in a cold climate. The landlord was responsible for snow removal. What happened to my clicker? Yeah, the contractor was late and someone slipped on the ice and hurt her elbow. And this scared the investor to death because she thought he was going to get sued. I don't think they actually got sued, but it was a liability and he felt vulnerable. So with multifamilies, the landlord is responsible for certain areas, unlike single family homes. The landlord's responsible for some common areas, for snow removal, the batteries and the smoke detectors and the hallways, that sort of thing. So there's a little more legal liability. How do you guys deal with that?
That's a great question. And this comes up all the time with clients that are just getting set up. And, there's a lot of marketing and a lot of push for setting up, LLCs and entities for liability protection. Here, it's just my opinion, and it's very subjective and personal, but I like to keep things really simple. I like to be covered and insure myself properly. What I recommend is, number one, if you are buying a multifamily or a single family for that matter, and you want to buy it in an entity for liability protection, you're 9 times out of 10 going to have a really hard time getting a loan because the entity is new and doesn't have any tax return history. So my experience, and this is what I coach my clients to do, with the exception, unless they have a very high net worth and they have a lot of assets and exposure in the market already, purchase the property in your personal name. You're going to get the best financing and the best interest rates in your personal name. And then you can always, after you close, transfer title over to the entity for liability protection. But here is the reality of that. My opinion is keep it in your name and over insure. That's the way you can protect yourself, in my humble opinion. And again, this is very subjective, so you have to do with what you're comfortable with. But if you're conservative in the names, you had this scenario, a trip and fall, you have a lawsuit. The way you mitigate that, if you're ultra conservative, is just pay a premium on the liability portion of your insurance. So to give you an example, in this example of a quad, which I own some of, I have $300,000 per door per occurrence, and that I sleep like a baby at night. Some people might say, you know what, I'll sleep better if I have a $500,000 per occurrence per door. Just know that your monthly payment and your premium is going to go up the higher your coverage. So it's so personal and subjective, Joe. There's not really a magic bullet for this one, but I just hate seeing new investors that are, you know, just getting started. They don't have any assets or a big portfolio, and you know their CPAs or maybe their lawyers are instructing them to set up, you know, all these complicated entities and protect themselves from. At the end of the day, if the lawyer on the other end is really good, they're going to figure out who the owner of that LLC is, and it's really just it is a second layer of protection. My opinion is you know, over insure if you're nervous about that.
Overinsure. Okay, that's a good way to go. We can't give legal advice on this show, obviously, but these are things to consider. Consider having an LLC, and certainly consider having overinsurance, more insurance than you think you'll need, and put that in your pro forma when you're crunching the numbers to see if you want to buy the fourplex or the duplex. See what the higher insurance costs, if it still makes sense. How often does this really happen? You have quite a portfolio in your property management company. How many times do you get sued over in a fourplex or a duplex?
Yeah, I was just going to say, knock on wood, Joe. I've never been sued in 25 years. Maybe I'm lucky. I don't know. I mean, that could happen tomorrow, right? I can't control what's going on in the world, but I think that if you give a good product and you have good management in place, you're going to have a lot less headache.
Mhm.
Can you scenario happen? 100%, but I think there's ways to mitigate that, and I have, knock on wood, have not had that happen in my whole career.
Yeah, I know a guy who's been investing for 40 years. He has about 200 doors, mostly single families. He's only been sued twice in all that time, and in both times he won. So there was no judgment. So I don't know. Sometimes lawyers like to make it sound like this can happen and it's going to be terrible for you, and therefore you need to hire the lawyer to set you up. But um, it's kind of a low probability, high consequence event. So it's not likely to happen, but if it does, it can really be annoying and drag out for years. So everybody has to decide for himself what their risk tolerance is and take it from there. Talk to your property management company. How often does this happen? How often do you actually get sued? Who's actually won a judgment? And then decide from there. All right. Well, those are some good horror stories and some good ways
Yeah.
to help mitigate the risk of multifamilies. Multifamilies are great. Let's sum it up. You get some economies of scale. You can build cash flow a lot faster than one house at a time, and you get economies of scale with financing, expenses, and management. You think about how hard it is to manage 10 houses or 12 houses versus managing 3 fourplexes. It's a lot easier. And like I said, with the loans, you have a Fannie Freddie limit of 10 loans. So if you, the investor, have 10 fourplexes, that would give you 40 doors instead of just 10. So you can scale up a lot faster. And the other great thing about multifamilies is they cash flow really well. You have one roof, one property, one loan, and you get multiple income sources, and they cash flow well per invested dollar. The other thing we didn't mention is multifamily, small multifamilies, 2 to 4 units, are a gateway to larger apartment buildings. Some investors want to eventually own a 24-unit apartment or a 40-unit apartment, and it's really hard to get a commercial loan from a bank if you have no experience in that asset class. But if you can show them that you have a couple of fourplexes and you know kind of what you're doing, you're more likely to get a loan for a larger apartment building if that's what you're interested in. Me personally, I'd rather have 10 fourplexes than have a 40-unit apartment building. With the 40 unit, you don't have diversification. You have all your eggs in one basket. You can imagine if you had a 40-unit apartment building in that Portland example, and they enacted those rent control laws, then you're kind of stuck. Whereas if you had 10 fourplexes spread out over a couple of cities or a couple of states, then you have some diversification. But that's me. Some investors want to go to the apartment buildings, and for those, multifamilies are a good stepping stone. So to review some of these tips, some of them are unique to multifamilies, but a lot of them apply to single-family homes as well. Find out what extra expenses you're responsible for, the common area maintenance kind of stuff for a multifamily. Consider the other landlords in the same neighborhood and how well they're taking care of their properties and whether you want to be next door to them. Use conservative vacancy assumptions in your pro forma. especially if you're having a 1-bedroom, 1-bath, or studio apartment. Stagger your tenants' leases so they don't leave all at once, or your leases don't expire all at once. You can space them out to 2 months apart, 3 months apart throughout the year, so you can mitigate your risk there. Consider multi-year leases in certain scenarios where you have a good tenant, so you don't get stuck with a bad tenant for 2 years. That's an option for you. You can reduce your turnover and keep your good tenants by having your rent slightly below market, or also by having good amenities, fixed finishes that make the tenant want to stay. And then also you can invest in landlord-friendly jurisdictions, or at least if they're not landlord-friendly, at least they're neutral. They're not hostile to landlords. And then these are all help you to reduce your turnover and reduce your risk. If you're buying one off the MLS, don't overinvest in renovations, or even if you're doing a renovation on an existing property that you bought, because the property value is going to be based on comps, so be careful about your renovation budget. And finally, make sure you're protected with extra insurance and/or LLCs. All right, so just as a reminder to the investors watching this, the markets where RealWealth Network has multifamilies. The new construction ones are in Dallas, Houston, Orlando, and Jacksonville. All of them have duplexes, and Jacksonville has also quads. And Jacksonville is not just in Jacksonville, they're building them all over Central Florida, as far as the west coast of Florida, near Tampa. And as for renovated multifamilies, Cleveland and Chicago are the two markets where we have those. And Cleveland's the only one that actually has sixplexes. Sometimes they get sixplexes that work. So if you're interested in multifamilies, you can take a look at that section on our website and talk to these providers. So to wrap it up, multifamilies can be a great asset class for building your cash flow and getting economies of scale, but there's also a couple of gotchas that you should be aware of, and we've gone over some of those today. So hopefully you found this worthwhile, and you can help avoid becoming a protagonist in your own horror story someday if you decide to buy a multifamily.